Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to the Grayzone. It's Max Blumenthal with Aaron Mate, and huge apologies to all of our UK audience, all of our audience in what used to be known as Europe. I don't even know if it exists anymore. As we've seen from the past week, our audience in that entire time zone, down to Middle East, or more appropriately West Asia, our audience on the continent of Africa, we really are letting you down by starting this late. But this is the only way we could do it today, and it's such a momentous occasion. We had to do a stream today, right, Aaron? I mean, history is being made in ways we never expected. And, Trump's press conference, I guess it was 2 days ago, it almost sounded like a Grayzone live stream if both of us suffered severe head injuries. We'll get into that right away. I want to get your reaction first to what is being denounced by Trump's domestic enemies as the most heretical foreign policy statement ever made by a sitting U.S. president, at least in our lifetime.
I think I have the power to end this war, and I think it's going very well. But today I heard, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal. I think I have the power.
Max, start again. You're muted.
I'm muted?
Not anymore, but you were muted. So just start your comment again.
Didn't mean to mute myself, but
I muted you to take off the echo on your clip.
Yeah. We do have an echo
when the clip plays. Yeah. So it's just but the answer is just to unmute yourself after the clip is over.
Well, Trump said that Zelensky started the war, and this has caused the biggest meltdown I've seen since Russiagate. What's your reaction?
Yeah, I'm not even sure if Trump meant to say that Zelensky started the war. He was just speaking off the cuff. But what he said repeatedly is that Zelensky could have avoided the war and ended it. And I think that's the important point. Everyone's freaking out and claiming that Trump claims that like Ukraine invaded Russia. That's not what he was saying. He was just saying that Zelensky should never have let this war start. And there's so many reasons why that is true. Zelensky had so many opportunities to avoid a Russian invasion. And Trump is walking away from what has been bipartisan policy for more than 10 years now, using Ukraine to provoke and ultimately bleed Russia. That's what the U.S.-backed coup in 2014 was all about. The subsequent encouragement to Ukraine to attack the Donbas, which was delivered by John Brennan, as I've reported on. The subsequent sabotaging of the Minsk Accords, which could have ended that war that broke out. The refusal to negotiate with Russia before it invaded, and then the sabotage of the Istanbul peace talks after Russia invaded, and ignoring so many other overtures from Russia that we've heard about since. So Trump is basically right in saying that this all could have been avoided had Zelensky made different decisions. My only problem with his critique is he's putting too much on Zelensky. He's saying that, Zelensky played the U.S. No, the U.S. played Zelensky. They used him as a puppet, and they didn't back up his peace mandate that he was elected on. Now, I don't think Trump knows all those details. It doesn't really matter. The point is he's walking away from the policy, and that to me is the most important thing. His comments to me don't really carry that much significance. It's what he's doing with his actions, and what we're seeing so far is he's abandoning this proxy war project. And you can see that by the fact that he's even speaking to Russians. So Marco Rubio meeting with Sergei Lavrov, something that Antony Blinken refused to do for at least the first year into Russia's invasion. They wouldn't even talk. Talking about lifting sanctions, reestablishing contacts. Trump effectively already ruling out NATO for Ukraine, which was one of the major reasons why this war happened to begin with, because Biden refused to take it off the table, only to tell Ukraine at the very end, yes, sorry, I'm not giving you NATO. You're not ready for it. So Trump is just willing to say out loud what Biden refused to say before, because Biden wanted to use the prospect of Ukraine joining it to bait Russia into a war. And it seems like Trump is done with that now, finally. And I don't see how anybody can see that as a bad thing. This is the fact that the world's top 2 nuclear powers are even speaking. That's something worth welcoming. No matter what Trump's own rhetoric is around it, or what his own personal motives are, it's a good thing that there's talks. And it's a good thing that those talks entail trying to end this horrific war.
Yeah, I'm glad Trump said that, though. I'm glad he said Zelensky started it. I mean, no one remembers Poroshenko, first of all. So Zelensky is Project Ukraine. He was brought to power by American advisors, including Nina Jankowicz. She actually was on his team. He's an American product. He's only there because of the U.S., and specifically because of the transatlantic faction in U.S. politics, which is now represented by the Democratic Party, because all of the sort of neocon Republicans have joined the Lincoln Project or have been put out to pasture by Trump. Zelensky's Ukraine has no sovereignty at all. That's why he wasn't invited, because what's the point of inviting the proxy when the U.S. was always determining whether Ukraine would negotiate or not? So Trump said Zelensky started it. Of course, Zelensky didn't literally start the war by invading in February 2022. The Russian special military operation began the full-scale war. But once you start interrogating Trump's comment and the fundamental truth that it's based on, Trump expresses things in very crude and often cretinous ways, but sometimes there's a fundamental truth behind it. Once you start interrogating that, the entire narrative of Ukraine is this brave, plucky democracy fighting on the front lines of freedom against a country that wants to reestablish the Soviet Union falls apart, because you have to actually examine the context that you laid out week after week, Aaron, or that Scott Horton has laid out over the course of 690 pages in his new authoritative and aptly titled book, Provoked. I mean, this book, if you want to just end an argument with a, Ukraine military aid supporter or a NATO troll, just refer to that book. And if you can't end the argument, it's big enough that you can just bludgeon your opponent over the head with it repeatedly, and that'll end it. It's a massive doorstopper of a book. But the whole history there from 2014 on, and even before, explains why this war happened. War was inevitable. And, I've been warning about this since 2014. I'm one of those few Americans who saw this coming from my little corner of the internet. But you know who else said the war started in 2014? It's not John Mearsheimer. It's not Jeffrey Sachs or any of our friends that are on Judge Napolitano. It was Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO in 2013.
Didn't start in February last year. The war started in 2014. And since 2014, NATO allies have provided support to Ukraine with training, with equipment. So the Ukrainian armed forces were much stronger in 2022 than they were in 2014. And of course, that made a huge difference when President Putin decided to attack Ukraine.
Obviously, Stoltenberg is speaking from an alternate, opposite angle to Trump. But there he is. He's saying the war started in 2014. The war started with the Maidan coup, and which led to the annexation of Crimea, because which country is going to allow a hostile foreign power in Washington to control the government and hand-selected, as Victoria Nuland in the Obama administration was doing in Ukraine, and then deprive a whole part of the population in the East, the Russophone population, of their national rights? They're not going to allow it to happen. Crimea was annexed, and that really was the beginning of the war. And then Ukraine was aggressively NATOized, which made the full-scale war inevitable. So Trump kind of landed on a very forbidden truth, which I think is the essential truth that Americans need to understand to know why this war needs to be ended and that the US has all the power to do it.
Jens Stoltenberg also said that Putin went to war to prevent more NATO on his border.
President Putin declared in the autumn of 2021, and he actually sent a draft treaty that he wanted NATO to sign to promise no more NATO enlargement. That was what he sent us. And that was a precondition for not invade Ukraine. Of course, we didn't sign that. The opposite happened. He wanted us to sign a promise never to enlarge NATO. He wanted us to remove our military infrastructure in all allies that have joined NATO since 1997, meaning half of NATO, all the Central and Eastern Europe. We should remove NATO from that part of our alliance, introducing some kind of E and B or second-class membership. We rejected that. So he went to war to prevent more NATO close to his borders.
He went to war to prevent more NATO across his borders. That's from Jens Stoltenberg, not from Vladimir Putin. And Donald Trump is basically saying the same thing now, and abandoning that policy of trying to expand NATO into Ukraine. That he's now being pilloried for just saying out loud what everyone has been denying for so long, even though people like Jens Stoltenberg admitted it, that's what this war is about. And the freak out, I got to say, it's pretty wonderful to see, because these are people who have pushed, not just a policy that has threatened the world, because we're talking about tensions between the world's top nuclear powers, but has destroyed Ukraine. Hundreds of thousands of people have died. And of course, it's not, Ukrainian society across the board that feels the impact. It's lower class Ukrainians who are dying on the battlefield, who are being pulled into these vans by Ukrainian military kidnappers, basically, to go fight off and die. People who can afford it can afford to flee the country or bribe their way out of being enlisted. So for the sake of Western proxy warriors, young Ukrainians from the lower classes have been dying. And if Donald Trump puts an end to that, that's a wonderful thing. And that's why all the people who've profited off this and pushed this for so long are freaking out right now, because their project is coming to an end. And we're seeing, as you said, we're seeing who really runs the show. As soon as the U.S. turns off the spigot, everyone recognizes that it's over. A year ago, Emmanuel Macron of France was like, toying with the idea of like sending French troops to Ukraine, right? Remember that? He was being a tough guy. Well, what's happening now that Trump is basically pulling out the U.S.? Macron just said that, yeah, no, we're not sending troops. Of course not. It was all a tough guy act, with Ukrainians with Ukrainians being the only ones, along with European consumers, but mainly Ukrainians with their lives literally being told to bear the sacrifice.
Yeah, I think Macron is going to send troops against Candace Owens before he sends them to Ukraine. And he's pulling troops out of Africa left and right. They're just getting kicked out. Everyone hates him. And it's not because the French are like rude or something. It's because the French military has done a terrible job on security in Western Africa, in the Sahel. So there's no European troops that will fill the gap. There was never much backfill on any weapons they needed rushed to the battlefield in the first place. Ukraine was losing. But the fundamental issue here is Ukraine's sovereignty. And there is none, because of a decision that was made by the United States in coordination with its Ukrainian USAID-sponsored partners in 2013 to topple the elected government of Viktor Yanukovych in a coup, which culminated in early 2014. And with that coup, Ukraine didn't shift from Russian-controlled to democratic. It shifted from neutral, a neutral country that had friendly economic relations with its powerful nuclear-armed neighbor, which seems to be a smart form of diplomacy. It also keeps energy prices down for a population that is poorer than in much of the rest of Europe. But then they switched to Western-controlled, NATOized beachhead of anti-Russian militarism, which is just a disaster for your country. The disastrous stage was set in 2014, and Ukraine then complimented Israel and Taiwan as imperial bulwarks. And as soon as the United States decides that they're not going to send a weapons package, your country faces existential doom. That's the choice that they made. And the Ukraine, and Aaron, I want maybe you can expound on this. The Ukrainian government, particularly of Zelensky, leaned on the Biden-Obama faction that ushered in the Maidan coup, and large sectors of Ukrainian quote-unquote civil society, the USAID-funded so-called independent media outlets and NGOs, weighed in the Russiagate hoax against Trump. And so by leaning so hard on one faction, one power mafia in Washington, you're setting the stage for your demise as a servant, as an imperial proxy with no sovereignty that's no longer neutral. You're setting your stage for your demise as soon as they're out of power.
Yeah, well, this is the sad thing, is a faction of Ukrainians got caught up in their Democratic Party backers' partisan battle with Trump. And recall, I mean, who helped put these people in power? It was people like Victoria Nuland, who was serving in a senior State Department role, a major player in the 2014 Maidan coup, to the point where there's that leaked audio intercepted of her and the U.S. ambassador basically selecting who should be to the top Ukrainian leaders in a new government. That's how influential the U.S. was in the coup camp, is that Victoria Nuland took it upon herself to pick who should be in and out of government. And the people who came to power in Ukraine after they took power in 2014, they continued to double down by basically colluding with the DNC in 2016 against Trump. You had Ukrainian officials meeting with DNC officials and putting out what turned out to be likely concocted claims about Paul Manafort taking secret illicit payments. And this was celebrated openly at the time. They admitted it. This is a headline from the Financial Times in 2016, in August 2016. Ukraine's leaders campaign against pro-Putin Trump. And they were bragging about it. They were taking credit for the fact that by that point, Paul Manafort was forced to resign because they had leaked this so-called ledger of him receiving secret payments from Yanukovych and his allies. And amazingly, this guy right here, pictured, Sergei Lyshenko, he's now an advisor to Zelensky. So it didn't occur to these people. I mean, I wonder if, did they think that maybe this would eventually come back against them, like this blowback? Yeah. I don't think Trump forgot about this. Now, the problem is the U.S. corporate media, every time they talk about the claim that Ukraine interfered in the 2016 election, they always dismiss that as a Russian conspiracy or Russian disinformation. But the Financial Times is not a Kremlin mouthpiece. And this guy here, Sergei Lyshenko, is not working for the Kremlin. They were bragging about it in 2016. So I don't think the Trump camp's forgotten about this. And I think part of this is blowback for Russiagate and also for Trump's first impeachment, where he was impeached as he froze weapons to Ukraine while also pressuring Ukraine to look into the corruption of the Bidens and also the role of Ukraine in Russiagate. Because one thing we also learned recently is that John Brennan, a major player in Russiagate, when he was heading the CIA and effectively controlling Ukrainian intelligence, he used Ukrainian intelligence to help lodge the allegation that Russian hackers hacked the DNC and gave the emails to WikiLeaks. So Ukraine has been used in this partisan battle, and I think that's ultimately what sealed their fate, is like the Trump team finally is taking revenge. And and your point about Ukraine losing its sovereignty in the process. Okay, well, here's one example, and it also speaks to this talking point that people were so offended when Trump called Zelensky a dictator because he hasn't held elections, for example. And you could argue, you know, I'm sympathetic to the argument that it's hard to hold elections during a time of war. But the problem is Zelensky has been acting dictatorial since well before Russia invaded. So this is, for example, a headline from February 2021, a year before Russia invaded. Ukraine shuts TV channels it accuses of spreading Russian disinformation. And that was when Zelensky, again, a year before Russia invaded, shut down 3 television networks that were linked to his political rival Medvedchuk, who was close to Putin. And what this sent the message to ethnic Russians inside Ukraine and to Moscow that basically Zelensky was going to cut off the ethnic Russian component of Ukraine to the point where he wasn't going to allow their TV networks to exist. And the U.S. sent the message that it was on board with this because it cheered what Ukraine did, what Zelensky did. This is February 2021. The U.S. supports Ukraine's efforts to counter Russia's malign influence in line with Ukrainian law in defense of its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Okay, so speaking of sovereignty, this crackdown on free speech, the shutting down of of 3 opposition TV networks, this was not done just with Zelensky acting on his own volition. Zelensky's aide later admitted to Time magazine that this was, quote, a welcome gift to the Biden administration. This is from Simon Schuster, who basically embedded with the Zelensky team. He wrote a whole book about Zelensky called The Showman. And this is what Schuster writes. This is from February 2022. Shutting down these TV networks, quote, was also conceived as a welcome gift to the Biden administration, which had made the fight against international corruption a pillar of its foreign policy. As one Zelensky aide put it, the decision to go after Putin's friend Medvedchuk, who was tied to these TV networks, was calculated to fit in with the U.S. agenda. And that's why the U.S. cheered Zelensky shutting down these TV networks, because the Biden administration wanted Zelensky to crack down on his opposition. Because at the time, Medvedchuk, who's close to Putin, was actually, in some polls, leading Zelensky. And they didn't want to have Medvedchuk's TV stations on the air. And so, but Russia took this as basically a sign that Zelensky had no interest in basically allowing the ethnic Russian component of Ukraine, which is sizable, concentrated in the east, to exist. And shortly after that, that's when Russia first started sending troops to its border with Ukraine, culminating finally at 1 year later in the invasion. So this welcome gift to the Biden administration by Zelensky helped ultimately welcome a Russian invasion. And it's a good example of what you're talking about, how just Ukraine did lose its sovereignty after 2014, when, as Victoria Nuland bragged about, there were U.S. advisors in so many Ukrainian government ministries, and so much money was flowing from the U.S. into Ukraine that, as Samantha Power later admitted, the U.S. was paying the salaries basically for the Ukrainian public sector, along with, we recently learned, a majority of Ukrainian so-called independent media outlets.
95%.
Yeah.
These are the same outlets and personnel that say we're sponsored by China and Russia. It's pretty ironic. This is the price you pay if you don't have sovereignty. You don't control your own resources. You don't have diplomatic relations with your most powerful neighbor. In fact, you're hostile, and you're totally dependent on a power thousands of miles away. And you've even interfered against one power mafia there. They're going to come for you.
Yeah.
That is the tragedy of Ukraine. And you mentioned Viktor Medvedchuk. He was the founder of the Patriots of Ukraine party. It's so disgusting to see the way that he is and his party are portrayed in U.S. media. It's as if they're just this Russian foreign implant, when Ukraine was constructed as a country, like many other countries. It's an invented country, like so many countries, that had 35 to 40% of the population with deep ties to Russia on their border that spoke Russian. Then you have in the West the population of Galicia and Carpathia from Lviv, who are, embody the Ukrainian nationalism that has dominated the government since the Maidan coup, and which denied national rights to 35 to 40% of the whole population. If you look back at the past Ukrainian election, see who voted for Medvedchuk and who voted for the nationalist candidate. It was the last Ukrainian election before Maidan. I think, what was it, 2011? That tells you what kind of country Ukraine is, and it sets the stage for a kind of civil war. And that's what was happening in the Donbas when Russia intervened. This war was really about the Donbas. It wasn't about taking over Ukraine and then moving on to Poland and the Baltic states. And the West couldn't understand that. But the West was complicit, if not actively involved, in the denial of rights to an entire, almost half of the Ukrainian population, starting with its leadership, Medvedchuk, who, after having his TV stations banned, was captured and tortured by the Ukrainian SBU. He's now in Russia thanks to a prisoner exchange deal. This is part of the truth that Trump landed on when he accused Zelensky of being a dictator. Zelensky effectively is a Western-backed dictator at this point. And like so many other Western-backed dictators, he could pay the ultimate price. Saddam Hussein, backed by the CIA and the Reagan administration against Iran. Manuel Noriega, former CIA asset, backed by Carter's CIA, taken out by George H.W. Bush, and whose son took out Saddam Hussein. I mean, there are so many of these Western puppets who paid the ultimate price. What will happen, Aaron, if the weapons stop flowing to Kyiv and the aid stops flowing to a Western puppet government? What then happens inside Ukraine? What do you expect to see? And we actually have a super chat relating to that, so we should read. Will Zelensky go the way of Gaddafi or Hamid Karzai?
I would say the latter. He's got a lot of money. He's got properties in foreign countries. And I think that's Zelensky's future. There was all this propaganda, there's like a script written for him about, remember, he was said to have told the U.S., I don't need a ride, I need ammunition, which was written by some Western
CIA agent.
Yeah, well, sure. I mean, so I think that's Zelensky's future. And as for Ukraine, well, now you have all these heavily armed, heavily empowered militias, like the Azov Battalion, now called the 3rd Assault Brigade, okay, thanks to a Western-backed makeover. And are they going to just accept a peace deal? Are they going to accept a country in which ethnic Russians have rights or are no longer part of Ukraine? I doubt that. And you're going to have basically already a country that's one of the most, if not the most corrupt in Europe, if not the world, become even more corrupt. That's what happens when you destroy countries with conflicts. You flood them with weapons and foreign monies. They become even more corrupt. And so that, I think, is Ukraine's future. And for so many Ukrainians, there is no more future because they've been killed, and it'll be harder for future generations even to reproduce because so many young men have been killed. Thankfully, Ukraine's resisted U.S. orders to lower the draft age. That's the one way in which Zelensky's hold on to some semblance of sovereignty. Like he didn't obey their orders there to lower the draft age to 18. He's kept it at 25 after initially lowering it to 25 from 27 under U.S. orders. But it's bleak. It's really bleak. And they're not going to have a large part of their country. And the fault for that, I mean, aside from the U.S., it lies with those Ukrainians, those ultra-nationalists, neo-Nazis, whatever you want to call them, who just wouldn't accept that Ukraine is a divided country, which has an ethnic Russian component. And they never wanted to accept that part of their country. So therefore, they're going to lose a large part of it and become a lot weaker as a result.
They could have had more of their country if they had negotiated the deal on the table in April 2022, but they chose to listen to Boris Johnson and the Brits. And where is London now to save them? Like, you and what army? There's no British army. It's a joke. So they would have had more of their own land then, but Ukraine could have been whole and more prosperous if it had remained neutral. But for some reason, we are supposed to care about the nationalist lore of Bohdan Khmelnytsky being advanced by the Azov Battalion across Ukraine at the expense of 40% of its population. We are supposed to take one side in basically what was kind of a civil war, turn it into a proxy war, and then fork over billions and billions of dollars of our own money every year. No, Americans are waking up from the war propaganda. They're not going to do it. And Zelensky expected them to do this indefinitely. Without the U.S., he's nothing. So here's Zelensky's response to Donald Trump. He accuses him of living in a disinformation space a day after the president accused Ukraine of starting the war with Russia. So now Zelensky is basically turned into a counter disinformation researcher, and he's trying to fact check Trump, which is, one of the most fruitless activities ever. It's like the CNN fact checker who comes in like anytime Trump lies, Daniel Dale, and like it just becomes like kind of a laughing stock. But as I said, Trump hit on a fundamental truth, but he's also catering to a base of Americans who just don't want anything to do with this and don't see any benefit from it. Of course, there are many Americans who do. They live in the Acela corridor and in Silicon Valley. They have skin in the imperial game. They tend to be more affluent than a lot of the Americans who don't care about this. They make money off of the necro economy, the military industrial tech complex. And they are more represented by the Democratic Party, which has almost lost all power. So really seems to be coming to a crashing end. I don't know how much longer I'll give Zelensky to remain in power, but there's also the threat of the ultra-nationalists or the neo-Nazis in Ukraine who will blame Zelensky for this loss, accuse him of stabbing them in the back if he does negotiate, which he may just have to do. And that could further destabilize Ukraine.
Yeah, and that's where, again, he's faced their threat all along, and one powerful leader threatened to kill him, said that Zelensky would hang from a tree if he made peace with Russia and implemented the Minsk Accords. This was before Russia invaded. So Zelensky, he's not just a sellout, corrupt, a sellout to the U.S. He's also been boxed in by genuine threats to his life. Literally, that was the threat, that he will lose his life if he makes peace with Russia and implements the Minsk Accords. I'd be curious to find out one day, did the U.S. encourage Zelensky to increase the shelling of the Donbas right before Russia invaded? 3 years ago, pretty much to the day. 3 years ago today, Zelensky's government massively increased shelling of the Donbas. If you look at the map
from Branko R, Zelensky did start the war by massively violating the ceasefire in Ukraine, according to OSCE, before Russia invaded.
Well, there we go.
Aaron,
yeah.
Aaron, I remember you were tweeting about that at the time, all the OSCE documented violations like days before.
Yeah, so in the days before, and Moon of Alabama, the blog, I remember pointing this out first. That's where I learned about it. But it was, we look at the map of violations tracked by the OSCE, which was monitoring the situation on the ground. And in the days before, just the amount of shelling coming from the government side to the Donbas side was just massive. And the bulk of the shelling was falling on the Donbas side, meaning it came from the government-controlled territory. And that happened right before Russia invaded. This is at the peak of tensions. This is as also Zelensky simultaneously saying that we're not going to implement the Minsk Accords and refusing to rule out NATO membership, even though Germany and France tried at the last minute to get Zelensky to do that. So Zelensky refuses to rule out NATO. He increases shelling of the Donbas. He's at the Munich Security Conference talking about reacquiring nuclear weapons. And his top aides are saying we're never going to implement the Minsk Accords because it's effectively surrender to Russia. So, I mean, in that context, that's why Trump faulting Zelensky here makes a lot of sense. And my only problem with Trump's critique is that he doesn't take ownership of the U.S. role, including his own government. When he was in office in his first term, he tore up the INF treaty with Russia. That was a massive escalation of tensions. That was at the heart of Russian grievances that they tried to address in their offer to the U.S. in late 2021 before Russia invaded. So Trump played a role in this too. And you could argue, of course, he was under pressure from Russiagate, which made any kind of diplomacy impossible. He was boxed in as well, like Zelensky was. But still, he has some ownership of this as well. But the overall thrust that Russia was provoked massively, and that the U.S. were the U.S. in Russia's position. The only difference, the U.S. would have gone to war long before Russia did. And the Minsk Accords were basically a compromise between all sides. The Minsk Accords was basically Russia accepting a coup government in Ukraine that the U.S. had helped install. And what Russia was saying is, okay, fine, if you're going to have a coup government, and if you're going to have a government that is now effectively run by the U.S., where Joe Biden can get your top prosecutor fired if he wants to, and have his son get a fancy gas company board seat, and where American advisors are embedded inside the Ukrainian government, basically telling Ukrainian officials what to do, which was what was going on, then fine, we're going to have a say in Ukraine as well. And that's going to come through. You're going to recognize the autonomy of the Donbas, grant ethnic Russians their rights. And through that, you're not going to be able to join NATO because the Donbas will effectively have autonomy over that. It was a compromise, just like declaring neutrality in a divided country is a compromise. So we're not going to join NATO, but we're also not going to join a Russian-led military bloc. That's what you do in deeply divided countries if you're sensible and you don't want to have conflict. What the U.S. did, because they saw an opportunity, is they exploited that divide to their advantage. And in the process, Ukraine's been left destroyed. And now Zelensky's being thrown on the bus, as was always going to happen once he became expendable.
I want to do the freak out over this, review some of the best freakouts, but I want to ask one more question. And we're going to be joined by a special guest in about 10 minutes. So I hope he can hang on there as we shift to a different. Well, actually, we'll still be talking about European warmongering and pathology. Why are the European transatlanticists so afraid of giving peace a chance here? What are they so afraid of? What are the stakes for them? Because you would think that if relations were a little bit more normal with Russia, Germany's economy would be more powerful. The rest of the Western European economies would be a little more stable. The grain would flow. Energy prices would go down. What are they so afraid of? And what are the Democrats so afraid of here? Why is Bernie Sanders so afraid of peace here? He denounced peace.
Well, Bernie, I just think is a dupe and just has abandoned his critical thinking skills and has maybe subconsciously internalized, like done a cost benefit calculation that if he were to advocate peace, it wouldn't be worth it to him because he'd be marginalized even more and wouldn't have a voice. He wouldn't have the little platform he has. I don't know. I don't know. We have a really powerful propaganda system that works really well. I mean, just look at how everybody, with some exceptions, was just in lockstep with this proxy war from the start. And everyone forgot all the context that you need to understand the Ukraine conflict, and that they used to talk about. Bernie used to criticize NATO expansion and then pretty much forgot about it. Democracy Now! Used to cover things like the coup in 2014. They used to have on guests like Stephen F. Cohen. Everyone just forgot about it because that's how our propaganda system works. It incentivizes conformity and it punishes critical thinking. And everyone went along with it. As for Europe, I don't know. You have a better handle on that than me. I mean, to what extent was there some outright corruption, coercion going on? Why would Olaf Scholz go along with the demolition of his country, sit there and let Joe Biden brag about how he's going to stop the Nord Stream pipeline and then go ahead and do exactly that? Unless he was coerced in some way, bought off, intimidated. I don't know.
Well, the issue of why the British are so fanatical about this proxy war, I think, differs from the rest of Europe. But overall, the kind of transatlantic pro-NATO faction in Europe will completely lose credibility if they lose and there's a negotiation here. And the populist right, since the populist left has been killed by the pro-NATO faction over the past decades, will gain power and gain steam and will gain credibility. That's one principal fear. The domestic reaction will be strong. They'll have to take in more Ukrainian migrants after denying Ukraine EU membership. Russia may seek the over $350 billion of assets stolen from it and stolen from its own citizens by Europe, just basically pillaged and given to Ukraine. It could seek it through legal action. And NATO will have been stymied. So, and then it goes back to the issue of sovereignty. European countries will seek sovereignty instead of depending on the protective umbrella of NATO, which has been exposed fully by the Trump administration as nothing more than a cat's paw for American hard power and a cipher for for defense industry profits. And then there's the gravy train. The gravy train will dry up. where will it go next? Afghanistan was a major gravy train, a major money laundering operation. Money went through Afghanistan. It didn't stay there. It went back to the arms industry, went back to tech contractors. Same thing was happening in Ukraine. That comes to an end. A lot of people are going to be, a lot of transatlantic elites will be hurt by that. So I'm just hitting on a few reasons, but I think this is one of the key questions is what are they so afraid of? And then there's the hysterical ideological perspective of Democrats that Putin actually wants to take over the world and create this authoritarian, ultra-conservative, Christian, Orthodox, global patriarchate and ban gay pride parades and things like that. And you know, he'll collaborate with Trump to take over the world and maybe divide it up with China. That's their fear. And the real, beyond that, the real fear of a multipolar world. So this is such a decisive moment. And I don't know, someone who's qualified to talk about this as well is in the green room right now. Ali Abunimah, do you want to weigh on this? In on this? Give me a thumbs up if you do, or we can just move on. Thumbs up. He's not a
no answer. You know,
right,
last thing I'll say, and then we can bring Ali in, and then if we want to cover later on the neocon freakout, there's a lot to make fun of, but just this is also explains why they sabotaged Jeremy Corbyn, because Jeremy Corbyn's like the one prominent member of the left in the West, in NATO land, who didn't fall for all this. He was always against this proxy war. He's always in favor of diplomacy. He didn't buy into all this Russia fear mongering, and therefore he had to be eliminated. And he was, and that was our last chance for a populist leftist alternative to all this. All that we're seeing now, where basically the choice is between like neocon centrists and then, you know, people on the far right who demonize immigrants for all society's problems. And we had a genuine alternative to all of that, Jeremy Corbyn, who was sabotaged.
Yeah, Mike Pompeo promised to sabotage him if he came into power, publicly promised to sabotage him as CIA director. I mean, and this is part of what JD Vance was talking about at the Munich Security Conference when he condemned the European firewall, and a lot of people weren't listening. He said against right-wing populists and left-wing populists, and he was referring also to Jeremy Corbyn and Sarah Wagenknecht. This is the EU.
I didn't know that.
The EU has a firewall against any anti-war leftist, any leftist who does not support Israel, does not swear loyalty to Israel and the transatlantic project. And Western intelligence, the Five Eyes, will collaborate to destroy them, as we saw with Jeremy Corbyn. I don't think Wagenknecht has gotten that far, although she's, you know, emerging as kind of a kingmaker in Germany. Germany's just, we'll talk about Germany with Ali. Let's do like 3 to 5 minutes of freakouts.
Okay. All right. Well, there's a lot to choose from.
Let's do Chris Murphy, one of my.
All right, Senator Chris Murphy,
who was on the Maidan. He was on the Maidan with John McCain in 2014.
And after Yanukovych was overthrown, he bragged. He said that it was our actions that helped bring about this change in regime. So Chris Murphy openly took credit for regime change back in 2014. So he can take credit for all of the death and destruction that has occurred since. So he owns a large part of this crisis, given that he took ownership of it. But here he is responding to Trump's Ukraine proxy war shift.
Yeah, there's no separation between the Kremlin and the White House right now. The White House is a full-time Kremlin propaganda operation. The way in which they have blamed Ukraine for starting the war, blaming the continuation of the war on Zelensky, calling him a dictator. This is music to the ears of Russia, who I think knows that it is probably months away from being able to own and control most and eventually all of Ukraine. It's a devastating moment for the free world. And I just think that the White House are fools if they believe that Putin will stop there. He is going to see a green light to continue to use force to expand Russia's borders. And eventually, I think there's a real probability that American troops are going to have to fight abroad to protect the global world order and our allies, and perhaps American sovereignty itself.
This is the only talking point they have left, that if we don't stop Putin in Ukraine, he's going to invade other nations, even though, of course, he's been in a quagmire for 3 years. I mean, this is a 3-year-long war, and Russia's taken about 20% of Ukraine. So they somehow think after all that, a country right on Russia's border, where Russia has taken about 20% in 3 years, that somehow Putin's going to end this war and then go on to somewhere else. It's just straight up fear mongering. It's the same thing that, like, you know, it reminds me of the Rock WMD propaganda that the next, you know, that if we don't act now, the next warning sign will be a mushroom cloud. You know, it's this typical neocon propaganda. If we don't fight them over there, we'll have to fight them over here. But they're desperate. Murphy is desperate to keep his own Ukraine proxy war project going, something that he took part in more than 10 years ago with the successful regime change in Kyiv.
Well, how is the U.S. going to send troops to stop Russia if the U.S. is controlled by Russia? I mean, Chris Murphy's faction isn't in power, so how's that going to happen? It's kind of crazy to hear him put that on the table, though.
Yeah.
A liberal Democrat. I mean, it just shows they have nothing to respond with other than the discredited Russiagate narrative. And I think we're going to see in negotiations that the U.S. and Russia are not on the same page. Trump and Russia are not exactly on the same page. Also, Russia will not own all of Ukraine. Western Ukraine in any scenario is going to be Ukrainian. I mean, I think it's just the Donbas, Lugansk and Donetsk and Crimea that will be quote unquote owned by Russia. What else do we got? Roger, we got a Republican.
Here's Ruben Gallego, Democratic senator.
Yes, but what, Paul, do you believe that Vladimir Putin will stop at Ukraine? If the Americans, if Donald Trump gives Vladimir Putin what he would like, allows him to keep the territory that he has stolen essentially from the Ukrainian people, will he stop there?
The history of Russia, whether it's communist Russia, Tsarist Russia, whatever the heck Putin is always to expand, always to try to get more and more and try to conquer more and more, especially anything that they consider their former territory. But, you know, Russia is a weak country. And for some reason, this president is just enamored with the idea of Russia being the strong country. Russia historically has lost almost all of their wars, especially all the wars of expansion. And we need to give and empower Ukraine the ability for them to actually absolutely destroy Russia. Because destroying Russia means that the rest of Western Europe is secure too.
Well, that's why the war started.
Because they wanted to destroy Russia. Yeah. And how's that going? It's been 3 years of war. Is Russia destroyed? Like, does he somehow think that more weapons will now make a difference when Ukrainians have to be kidnapped to fight on the front lines? It's just absolutely insane. And it's easy to say when you're not bearing any cost except for paying for it. But in terms of human lives, it's Ukrainians who are being sacrificed. And that's what the policy is. Should we do Bernie Sanders? Do you want to hear from him how pathetic this is?
Well, we should. Yeah, I guess.
Or
you should. I just wanted to point out Ruben Gallego was a veteran, so maybe he can lead the fight to destroy Russia. Bernie Sanders has never been in war, but now he kind of sounds like a neocon. I mean, if you just AI voiced Paul Wolfowitz over this, it would be hard to tell the difference between the two of them.
Yesterday, we witnessed an extremely sad moment in American history. We saw the President of the United States aligning himself with the dictator of Russia, Vladimir Putin, to undermine the independence of Ukraine and its democracy. Let's be clear. Trump is showing us that he sees one of the world's most brutal dictators as his friend and our longtime democratic allies in Europe as his enemies. He wants a world that is safe for authoritarians and oligarchs, but extremely dangerous for democracies.
So, yeah, Bernie's right that this is sad, because it's so sad that this progressive leader, who has at times in his life been involved in, I think, some very noble causes, he's now aligning himself, to use his words, with the neocon uniparty that has used Ukraine for its project as they openly admit, of bleeding Russia. Top Biden officials admitted this. Jake Sullivan, Lloyd Austin said the aim is to use Ukraine to weaken Russia, to hand Russia a strategic defeat. Bernie must have seen these comments. There's no way he missed them, but he's ignoring them and buying into all the propaganda. This is about defending a democracy against an authoritarian. And he basically wants to keep sacrificing Ukrainian bodies and also spending American taxpayer money. He's supposed to be about spending money on social services, building up the country, giving people health care. Instead, he's on board, I guess, with spending tens of billions of more dollars to enrich weapons contractors to pay for the weapons that ultimately sacrifice Ukrainians and Russians. That's Bernie Sanders' position.
Bernie Sanders is a joke. He is why there is no left-wing populism in the U.S. and a reason why there's really no left in the U.S. left, because he's ceded the narrative to J.D. Vance and the Trump MAGA right, which actually doesn't have a program to end the housing crisis or to lower egg prices or to address the real kitchen table concerns of working class Americans. But they have a narrative that's appealing. Why are we spending your money over there on a losing war when we could be doing things, building infrastructure at home? Why doesn't Bernie Sanders just say that? It's because he adopted think tank lanyards like Matt Duss as his foreign policy brain, when his own instincts should be telling him that the American public wants populism. It's just very simple. Bernie Sanders he could never mount a campaign again in this environment. He has no idea what's going on with the American public, what the pulse of the public is. And it's the same as the pulse of the European public, where the left has been killed, deliberately killed by intelligence infiltrators like Paul Mason and left liberal neocon adjacent green doofuses like George Monbiot and figures like Owen Jones. They've all been planted there as the left, this cartoonish left, in place of real left populism, which has been just devastated by intelligence campaigns. And now all that's left in its wake is the right-wing populism, which is surging, of the AfD, of the Freedom Party in Austria, of Nigel Farage in the UK, Le Pen in France. That's all that's left. And the left figures like Bernie Sanders deserve huge blame for this. One thing they've done, which they deserve blame for, is just casting their lot with NATO. The same NATO that staged Operation Gladio to destroy the left in Europe. So at this point, I kind of look at Bernie Sanders as kind of a traitor.
Well, here's an example. Here's an example with Bernie. Like, let's say, okay, Bernie's done some good things in his life. He advocated Medicare for all, put that on the map. So let's give him a pass for not knowing everything about foreign policy, because he focuses on domestic policy, and that's domestic policy has been more his focus in recent years. So okay, even if you give him a pass for that, just look at what happened to him when you're talking about these intelligence deceptions that he's now going along with. They were used to undermine him. Specifically, the Russian boogeyman was used to sabotage his own political agenda, his own political career. And he's going along with it. So remember this in 2020 in the primary, when Bernie was still in the race. On the eve of the Nevada caucus, we get this headline, the Washington Post: Bernie Sanders briefed by U.S. officials that Russia is trying to help his presidential campaign. So the same people who were behind the scam that Russia colluded with Trump and that Russia brainwashed millions of people into not voting for Hillary Clinton, then turned around, took that successful playbook, which Bernie Sanders, of course, went along with after 2016, and used it against Bernie. That was Bernie's reward for playing along with Russiagate, is that it got used against him to sabotage him. And even after that, where he must have known back then what was going on, that they were using the fake Russian boogeyman to undermine him, he still goes along with it today and still gives these same people who are trying to undermine him and his agenda that's about peace and about spending money not on war but on social programs. He goes and gives them another gift of playing along with their agenda in 2025. It's just so sad. And so whoever he's listening to has done him and the progressive movement such a disservice. And it wouldn't be surprised me if it's someone like Matt Duss, who I remember when you asked at the time, Max, you asked Matt Duss, hey, did the U.S. intelligence community give you any evidence that Russia is actually trying to boost Bernie Sanders' campaign, or is this just another Russiagate scam trying to undermine someone who the neocons don't like? Matt Duss responded to, he said, well, actually, we were briefed, and we were briefed convincingly. So he accepted a scam that was being used to undermine Bernie Sanders. So they deserve all the criticism that is thrown their way, because they've self-sabotaged in ways that their opponents could only dream of.
Well, yeah, that was basically the Democratic Party establishment telling Bernie, look, this is what we're going to do to you if you keep going forward, so just give up, and we'll give you we'll give you like the chairmanship of the Senate Banking Committee, and you'll be remembered fondly by everyone and have a good life, but we'll destroy you utterly and make you do what we did to Trump if you continue. And you don't have the kishkas that Trump really has to stand up to this, and he proved it. So here he is. Anyway, I want to bring in Ali Abunimah at this, if he's ready. Are you ready? All right. I don't know if Ali needs any introduction, but Ali Abunimah is the founder of the Electronic Intifada, which is one of the, if not the premier publication on Palestine-related issues, advancing Palestine solidarity through journalism and analysis. And Ali, I know you have a lot to say about what we've been talking about, so feel free to weigh in on your take on Donald Trump's U-turn or radical shift on the U.S. policy toward Ukraine.
Well, I hope they've, yeah. Oh, hi, Max, and hi, Aaron, and hi, everyone. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, it's remarkable to watch I'm particularly, as you can imagine, enjoying the European freakouts. But I mean, will they carry through? Will they follow through? That's always the question I have with Trump, because he's very erratic, and at the same time, the U.S. imperial bureaucracy is full of true believers of these neocon forever wars and imperial wars. So yesterday, it was announced that Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, not anyone I'd have any admiration for, has ordered annual 8% cuts in the defense budget over the next 5 years, like 8% a year over the next 5 years, which seems incredible. I don't know if they could pull that off. So, but it does raise a question of what's their, is this their real agenda, and they're just masking it in this, make America great again, America first rhetoric. I don't know. Maybe they really do believe that the U.S. has to withdraw to its borders in order to focus on itself, which would be great if they do. I mean, they're doing all sorts of other horrible things. I'm not trying to tell you these are good people in any way, but less empire is good. I can't argue with cutting the defense budget. I can't argue with pulling out of the proxy war in Ukraine, which has killed 1 million people. And as you mentioned, they were trying to conscript teenagers, and the Ukrainians have resisted that. And they're so open about, we're fighting this war to destroy Russia, or to they just don't care. How anyone can think this has anything to do with what's good for Ukraine or Ukrainian people at this point, I don't know. When our imperial masters are saying openly that this is about destroying Russia, and it's just vile.
The one thing to watch out for, I'll just make a quick point on the Pentagon cuts. The question is, are they going to do actually an across-the-board Pentagon cut, or are they just going to reallocate Pentagon money to different departments and call it a cut? That's the point that William Hartung of Responsible Statecraft raised. That to him, this looks like, rather than like an across-the-board spending cut, they're just reallocating money to Trump's priorities, like building a so-called Iron Dome for the U.S. So that'll be the question. Is this a genuine defense cut as it was billed as, or are they just going to shift money around to different priorities for Trump?
We don't know. And then isn't most of the Pentagon budget actually veterans benefits? I don't know if that falls under how much of that falls under the Pentagon, and there is the Department of Veterans Affairs, so maybe that's different. But there's a lot that they may want to cut that is actually, I won't say good, but is more about like supporting humans than cutting weapons and fire. So I don't know, but this is rhetoric we haven't heard before. Nobody has ever talked about we're going to cut the defense budget. Aside from how genuine it is, Kamala Harris was promising to make the US military the most lethal in the world and increase the budget. And so it's a change of rhetoric that maybe creates openings that I wish there were a credible non-right-wing party or politicians who are willing to take that up instead of what we've seen, which is these fake progressives who fall into line behind empire every single time.
Well, they have skin in the game. We really hard to tell what the Trump administration is going to do with the U.S. military. And the pivot to Asia hasn't quite happened yet. There's some negotiation taking place there. But expect Taiwan to go the same way as Ukraine at some point. And I think that's the ultimate lesson of Ukraine. And then there's Israel, which freaks out when one shipment of 2,000-pound bombs gets just paused by a Biden administration that's giving it more weapons than it ever received in history. Ali,
and that's the big question, because with this America First rhetoric, or this idea that we're not going to commit, the US is not going to commit tens, hundreds of billions to a country like Ukraine, or that it's not going to commit to defending Taiwan, which they haven't really, I don't know how much they've shifted their position openly on Taiwan yet, but that would, I bet there's a lot of people in Taipei who are worried about that. And also Europe and the Western Europe and their seeming divorce with Western Europe does raise the question about where does Israel fit into this? Is Israel going to be the exception as usual, where Israel is exempt from any type of reassessment or realignment or cuts? I would bet that's the most likely outcome, but I don't think it's entirely clear yet. I don't know what you guys think about that.
Well, I want to actually get your reaction to something else that the Trump administration has been putting forward in Europe, which relates directly to you, and you being declared persona non grata by, I guess, 2 countries, which were both heavily involved in the Holocaust. This is JD Vance at the Munich Security Conference just about a week ago.
And unfortunately, when I look at Europe today, it's sometimes not so clear what happened to some of the Cold War's winners. I look to Brussels, where EU commissars warn citizens that they intend to shut down social media during times of civil unrest, the moment they spot what they've judged to be, quote, hateful content. Or to this very country, where police have carried out raids against citizens suspected of posting anti-feminist comments online as part of, quote, combating misogyny on the internet, a day of action. I look to Sweden, where 2 weeks ago the government convicted a Christian activist for participating in Koran burnings that resulted in his friend's murder. And as the judge in his case chillingly noted, Sweden's laws to supposedly protect free expression do not, in fact, grant, and I'm quoting, a free pass to do or say anything without risking offending the group that holds that belief.
So, of course, JD Vance did not mention anti-war activists, Palestine solidarity activists, he was talking primarily about right-wing activists and supporters of his own political trend. But you were recently arrested in Zurich, Switzerland, I think this month, for seeking to speak at a conference of Palestine supporters for the local Palestine committee. There's a new report by Asa Winstanley at Electronic Intifada. Files show that Swiss federal authorities' intelligence all opposed ban on you until mysterious last-minute U-turn, which raises a lot of questions. And it was a local official in Zurich, the local interior minister, who apparently made the call to have you arrested. So I guess I've kind of packaged two questions or two issues here. The first is, what do you think of Vance's comments on Europe and its crackdown on free speech, obviously leaving out the group that's being repressed the hardest in Europe, people who think like you and me about Palestine, and give us kind of an abbreviated background on what happened to you there and what the status of the case is now.
Yeah. Well, on its face, if you were just to hand me J.D. Vance's comments on a sheet of paper and I didn't know who made them, I would say this is completely correct. What he's saying is absolutely right. The problem, as you point out, is that they would probably support the crackdown on people like me, the Trump administration. And in fact, they are cracking down on people like you and me in the United States, where they have vowed to crack down on campus support for Palestinian rights and to crack down on universities that allow student protests against the genocide. So they are just as hypocritical. But on its face, his statements about Europe are correct. And I have found that out the hard way. It was actually just at the end of January when I went to Zurich. I was invited by local activists, Swiss activists, to do two events, one on a Saturday, one on a Sunday. And these were just like community teach-ins. This was not a big deal. This was not going to be in front of a national audience. If they had ignored me, probably very few people would ever have known about it. But what happened was, I got there on the Friday. This was January 24th. I had a very nice dinner with my hosts, and then the next morning I woke up and I met one of my hosts around noon, and we were walking towards the venue, which was in Zurich. It's a beautiful city. It was a warm day. We were just walking, and we get close to the venue, and suddenly I'm mugged. I thought I was being robbed. This big guy, like in this, with a ponytail and a beard, grabs me by the collar from the front, and then I feel more hands on me. And then they start shouting, Polizei, Polizei, police. And they drag me, handcuff me. They put me up against the wall, handcuff me, and throw me in the back seat of an unmarked car. And they speed off, and they take me to prison. And this is in front of my host, my companion, who was just absolutely stunned. And they took me to prison. They kept me there for 3 days. We had this sort of kangaroo court police hearing at the prison before they took me to the cell, where they said, you are accused of offending against Swiss law, but at no time then or now have they said what I did against Swiss law. Literally, all I had done was I'd arrived in the country, had dinner, bought some chocolate, and bought a Swiss Army knife. That's all I'd done since I arrived in Switzerland. And so they said, they accused me of offending against Swiss law. And then they said that they've determined that if I were to speak, it would incite people to go out and stab Jews. This is what they said at the police hearing. And they the example they gave, they said, as happened in March of 2024, when a lone jihadi stabbed a Jewish person in Zurich and severely injured them. Luckily, that person was not killed. I mean, I'm hearing all this when I'm in police custody. Only later did I go out, when I got out and researched what this case was of this stabbing. It was a 15-year-old boy, clearly a disturbed juvenile, who had stabbed a Jewish man. And this was such an exceptional case. And they were trying to use this as a pretext to stop me from speaking and put me in prison. And so that, I mean, a lot of people know what happened. And I told that whole story on the Electronic Intifada live stream. And that video is also embedded in Asa Winstanley's latest article. But what we found out since then through the discovery, because we are now in legal proceedings about this, we've got a lot of the paperwork, not all of it, but a lot of it. And it's pretty astounding, Max, because what happened was, as I said, I arrived on January 24th. January 24th, I landed in Zurich on a flight from Istanbul. I was coming from Jordan through Istanbul at just before 2 p.m. What we know now from the documents is that 2 days earlier, on January 22nd, the interior minister of the Zurich canton, Switzerland is a federal system, Zurich is, the cantons are basically like the states. So the Zurich canton or Zurich state, their interior minister, this guy called Mario Fair, who you've written about on the Grayzone, and we should probably show that article. The picture alone tells the whole story that people need to know. But Mario Fair, the head of security in the Zurich canton, had sent a request to the federal government, to the federal police. I guess it would be the equivalent of the FBI. That's Mario Fair. And as the Grayzone reported, he's this fanatically pro-Israel Zionist who's basically the interior minister for the Zurich canton. So he sent this request on January 22nd, accompanied by this memo prepared by the Zurich cantonal police, which we have, which goes through a bunch of my tweets. Tweets I would all defend, very accurate tweets, including, by the way, that I had called Kamala Harris a monster for supporting genocide, and that I'd accused Joe Biden of genocide. Those were in the Zurich police reports as reasons why I should be banned. Basically, among the reasons was criticizing the Democratic Party. And they said that in this Zurich report that my personal philosophy is Islamist jihadi terrorism. That's what they said in the Zurich Canton police report that went to the federal government, to FedPol. Now, on January 23rd, this is one day before I arrived, and we have all these documents now. FedPol responded, and they sent their own memo back to Zurich, and they said, we've examined what you sent us, and there is no basis for an entry ban on Ali Abunimah. The stuff you're saying about him doesn't add up. And not only that, but we sent inquiries to the NDB, which is the Swiss Federal Intelligence Service, I guess the equivalent of MI5 in the UK or the CIA in the US. And the NDB said, we have nothing on this person, no reason for an entry ban. The same with the immigration department. And the federal police actually, the memo they wrote, I mean, they defended me almost better than I could, which is incredible. And they say the following. This is just a couple of the quotes from the federal police memo. They say that, and they also say in the memo that not only did they go off what the Zurich canton had sent them, but they did their own, quote, summary examination of publicly accessible sources, which they even read my books. They went through my books. This is in the federal police memo. And they say, for example, the Zurich police claim that I use the terms Zionists, Jews, and Israel interchangeably. And FedPol said, no, he doesn't. He doesn't do that. Another thing they said that is, I think, incredibly relevant to the discussion you were having with Aaron before I came on, they said that saying that the historically grown conflict between Hamas and Israel has been one of the causes of the events of 7 October 2023 is an opinion protected by the freedom of speech, similar to the attribution of the Russian war of aggression to NATO's eastward expansion. So it's interesting that they put that in, because what that tells you is that there are probably efforts in Switzerland to criminalize people for talking about NATO's eastward expansion as a cause of the war. And FedPol have probably had to address this before, where they say, no, that's freedom of speech. And so what they say is, you're allowed to talk about the root causes of 7 October. That's freedom of speech. And then there's this incredible quote, which I couldn't agree with more, from FedPol, where they say, it is the task of the state not merely to tolerate the guaranteed pluralism of opinions, but to protect it. As long as no concrete violent extremist activities threaten the security of Switzerland, no entry bans can be issued under the authority of FedPol. That sounds absolutely great, except what happened the next day, which was January 24th, the day I arrived. The Zurich canton sent an email. I arrived at 2 p.m. I landed in Zurich. I was questioned at the airport, and that has to do, I believe, with the German ban on me, which is a separate issue. I entered around 2 p.m. At 5:01 p.m., the Zurich Security Department once again sent a request to the federal police and said, we really need a ban on this person. We really need this person banned. And then lo and behold, FedPol issued that entry ban, which I have. We of course have all these documents on the basis of the same Zurich memo that FedPol had completely rejected the day before. On the basis of the same reasoning, they had said, this does not hold any water. There is no basis for an entry ban. And the question is why? And what we know from the documents we have so far, we don't know all the emails, but we do have emails confirming that Mario Fair, this ultra-Zionist pro-Israel official, was involved. So what it looks like here, Max, again, we'll have to work this all out through the legal process, but if I were to take a guess, that you have a public official who did not like what he thought I was going to say about Israel, and got these police thugs to kidnap me off the street and throw me in prison for 3 days, where I was not allowed to contact anyone in the outside world, which is also part of the basis of our legal action, because there were so many violations of Swiss law in this, and so many violations of the European Convention on Human Rights, of which Switzerland is a signatory. And, you know, I'm not going to compare what I went through to what Palestinian political prisoners go through, but the precedent here is truly disturbing. That if they don't want, I was on my way to a teach-in with local activists. It was going to be like a quiet Saturday afternoon thing nobody would have known about, probably, except, I don't know, maybe 30, 40 people would have attended. And they threw me in prison to stop that happening. Incredible. And this is, of course, Max, in this context where this is happening all over Europe. My colleague Asa, who wrote that article at the Electronic Intifada, himself has been the target of Keir Starmer's thugs in the UK, where the police raided his home in October, confiscated all his devices, and they're investigating him criminally over tweets he's made about what's happening in Palestine. Richard Medhurst has been facing similar repression in the UK and in Austria recently, where he was detained and searched. Kit Clarenberg, who writes for the Grayzone, who's written for the Electronic Intifada, was questioned under the Terrorism Act, and so on and so on. And all over Germany, people are facing this kind of criminal repression. Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights, who par excellence is a representative of international law and all the things that we're told the West believes in, she could barely speak in Berlin the other day. The venue she spoke was canceled, and then it came out that they were even investigating whether they could arrest her. And so this is the climate in Europe, and it's, we have to stand up to it. And contrary to what J.D. Vance says, I think this is going to be the model that they're going to increasingly bring to the United States. Max, I'm not hearing you.
This is certainly the model that Kamala Harris would have advanced in the U.S. Her contacts with the Center for Countering Digital Hate, which are behind all these pushing for a lot of crackdowns in the UK, were extensive. Asa Winstanley, your colleague, was raided by the British police. Kit Clarenberg was detained by counter-terror cops. And we know about Richard Medhurst. In Austria, Richard Medhurst is accused of being a member of Hamas. I mean, this is wild. This is a wild escalation. The charges against Richard Medhurst, who was raided and detained and had all of his devices seized in Austria, is a real severe escalation. I would want to have him on, but it looks like he's not able to talk because he's fighting a serious case. I think maybe it would be wiser for him to speak through his lawyers. But that's the point. Richard Medhurst is a journalist, and 2 UN special rapporteurs have actually issued statements condemning these raids and this repression. We're going to have a piece up soon at the Grayzone by Kit about this. Another, I'm completely blanking on his name. Is it James Miller? Who is now had to take asylum in Russia. Johnny Miller, who is the press TV correspondent in the Donbas, frontline war reporter, has had to, who I believe is an American citizen or a British citizen, has had to take asylum in Russia because of the certainty that he would be jailed when he returned home for his reporting. So we reached out to him for comment. Here's some more video. Here's video from Francesca Albanese's event, which was stormed by police this is Francesca speaking about what took place at her event. And I should mention, there's been pressure in the U.S. to shut her down. She spoke, I believe, at like a special session in Washington, and there were members of Congress who condemned her participation, tried to prevent her from even entering the U.S. I showed my film Atrocity Incorporated at Busboys and Poets before she spoke. But even her arrival to the U.S. was contentious, but we have a First Amendment. We have constitutional free speech protections, unlike Germany. This is her speaking about what took place at her recent event.
I'm really shocked for the controversy that this event has stirred. It makes absolutely no sense whatsoever and makes me really scared for where Germany is. So I truly hope that the discussion will be peaceful, that there will be no tension, despite the fact that, frankly, I've never been in a place that has been received so many threats, intimidation, where the police has been checking on whether I could be arrested or not. This is pretty awful. And as a European, I will never forget this. And I hope it will get no worse than this.
And it's just incredible. I mean, she's a UN official that they want to arrest for talking about human rights and talking about international humanitarian law, and the German police want to arrest her. And there are many people in Germany facing this repression. I have my own history with Germany, because what happened last year is I was invited to a conference. Many other people were in Berlin, organized by Palestine solidarity activists there and the Palestinian community. This was in April. I was not planning to travel to Germany for that. I was going to speak online. But there were others who were going in person, including Dr. Hassan Abu Sitta, the British Palestinian surgeon who'd spent the first 43 days of the genocide in Gaza operating on people under the Israeli bombing. And when he came out of Gaza, he was, of course, going around speaking, telling about what he saw, what he witnessed. And so he flew into Berlin that morning of the conference, and he was immediately arrested at the airport, served with an expulsion order and a political speech ban, and deported back to the UK. And then the conference started. The first session happened. It got like less than an hour into the conference before the police cut off the electricity to the conference hall, raided it, arrested people, and shut the whole thing down. So then what happened is that because they had banned so many people, I got in touch with a lawyer in Germany, and I said, can we find out if there's a ban on me? Because the travel ban that they imposed on Dr. Hassan Abu Sitta was not just for Germany, it was for the whole Schengen area. This is about 24 countries, EU countries and non-EU countries. For example, Switzerland is not a member of the European Union, but it is part of the Schengen area. And so our inquiries came back and they said, yes, there is a ban on you, but it expired. So we didn't do anything. We didn't challenge it in court. Then the conference organizers said, we want to reorganize the conference that the police raided and shut down. But this time we're going to do it completely online. There's going to be no physical venue because effectively it is impossible to organize any type of lecture or conference about Palestine in Germany. No one will give you a venue to do it, either because they follow orders not to do it or because they're too scared to do it. So they could only do this conference online. And this was going to be in July. On the morning of the conference, my lawyer in Germany calls me like 2 hours before I'm supposed to speak live online. And he says, Ali, I just received an order from the German authorities that you are prohibited from speaking at this conference via Zoom from the United States. Like the German authorities think that they are going to tell me sitting in the United States what I can and can't say to who. This is crazy. And their order was accompanied by a threat that I could face 1 year in prison and a fine if I spoke to an audience in Germany by Zoom. I spoke to the lawyer. I said, I take responsibility. I'm going to do it. What can they do? He said, well, they can't come to the United States and do anything to you, but they could file a criminal case against you, which would give you problems if you ever travel to Germany. So for all I know, if I land in Germany, I could be arrested and charged with speaking to people via Zoom in Germany in violation of this order. And to be honest, I didn't take the threat that seriously, in the sense that, like, yeah, so they're threatening you with prison and a fine, but, you know, are they really going to do that? Well, I didn't take it that seriously. Now I do, after what happened in Switzerland. I really do. And I do not think it would be safe for me, and I don't think it's safe for many other people who do the kind of work we do, to travel anywhere in the EU or Europe or the Five Eyes countries. So I basically probably face more travel restrictions than Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant for speaking out against genocide. That's what our crime is. And I think a key thing here, Max, is that what they're doing, and I don't know too much about Richard Medhurst's case other than what you've said and that I've read, and I don't want to speculate about it without knowing the details. But the thing there is that they are redefining criticism, thought, advocacy for human rights, even affirming that Palestinians, like any other people under occupation, have a right to resist, that speech is itself terrorism, or that it is support for a terrorist organization. So they say, oh, we believe in free speech. We're not accusing you of, it's not what you say, it's that you're supporting a terrorist organization. And that's the direction they're moving. And that's where I think this ties into what they're doing. The Trump administration, the Trump-Vance administration says they're going to do on US campuses, where they're going to say that any foreign student, and it will start with foreign students, but it won't end there, that any foreign student who protests in support of Palestinian rights, or who blocks a road, or occupies a university building, is engaged in terrorism and will be deported. And we had Abid Ayoub from the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee on the Electronic Intifada live stream a few days ago. And he made this important point, which I think people should be aware of, which is he said, what they're going to do is they're going to use the minor offenses, like if you blocked a road, or if you did one of these actions where people go out in traffic and block the Brooklyn Bridge. That's going to be the thing they deport you on now, not your pure speech.
Yeah. Ali, you mentioned the Five Eyes Alliance, which includes Canada. And there's an example going on there right now. We haven't mentioned that, which we haven't mentioned yet, which is the arrest of Yves Engler, who is a Canadian author. He was just he's spending the night in prison right now, in jail, as we're recording this, because he was accused of harassment because he called a pro-Israel media personality a fascist and a genocide supporter on Twitter, X. And so when the Montreal police called him and told him he was going to be arrested for this, he went and announced this. The Montreal police then added a new charge, which is that he was also harassing the Montreal police for announcing that the Montreal police was going to arrest him for his free speech. And so literally he was arrested today in Montreal, and he's spending the night in jail. And he spoke just before he went into the police station today. And I want to just listen to some of what he said.
Well, while we're waiting,
see more Palestinian blood spilled. And after I publicized the fact that I was being charged for social media posts criticizing Israel, the police have responded by saying I'm harassing the police. So initially, I'm supposedly harassing a genocidaire for social media posts criticizing Israel. And then when I write about the fact that I'm being charged for criticizing Israel, the police are now saying they feel harassed. And a police investigator has actually brought in 4 different charges of harassment, intimidation, entrave, I guess interference, against me on the grounds that I wrote about the fact that I was being charged for social media posts criticizing Israel. And this is, I think, a pretty flagrant abuse of the state authority.
I mean, so that's him speaking right before he was then jailed, and he's spending the night in jail behind bars as we're recording this. It's just unbelievable. On top of the fact he gets charged to begin with for just criticizing someone on Twitter, saying they're a genocide supporter and a fascist, then he gets another charge for announcing those charges publicly.
It's really, it's like, it's not that any of us are naive about these countries and what they're really like, but this is stuff that stretches. I mean, it is just unbelievable what's happening. I think the gloves have come off in a way that I didn't really expect to see so blatantly, but it is. I mean, they're not playing games anymore. It's, we will throw you in prison. And I have to tell you that when I was in that Swiss prison, cut off from the world, I had no idea what was going on outside. I felt like, I said, does anyone know I'm here? And then on the first morning I was in the, after the first night, they came to the cell and they said, you have an appointment with the police. I said, well, if I have an appointment with the police, that must mean my lawyer is here, right? And they said, we just take you there. We don't, you know, we're just the prison guards. So they transported me to the police station side of this massive prison complex. And these two guys were there. They took me to an office with these two guys. One of them was Egyptian and the other was Swiss. And they said, we're from the Swiss Defense Ministry, and we want to talk to you about why you're in Switzerland, and maybe we can help you. And these were clearly intelligence agents. And I said to them, I said, well, is my lawyer on her way? They said, no. I said, well, then you better call her if you want to talk to me. I'm not going to talk to you without my lawyer. They said, oh, well, our lawyer, you know, your lawyer doesn't really have anything to do with this. We just want to sit down with you and figure out what's going on, and maybe we can help you. Of course, I wasn't going to fall for that. I said, take me back to the cell. When I got back to the cell, I felt at that moment this visceral fear that, like, I literally thought of Julian Assange. I thought the day before they said that if I speak, I'm going to incite people to go out and stab Jews. Now they have these intelligence agents here. Like, what are they going to frame me with? They're capable of anything. That is how I felt, that they are capable of anything. And at this point, I really think they are. And we all have to be extremely careful. I don't know how much we can prevent them doing this, because even if in the end, like Yves Engler, it's just insane what they're doing to him. Even if in the end these charges are thrown out, as they should be, if he's vindicated as he should be, still, what are they putting people through? How much is he going to have to go through in terms of just the ordeal of this, the trauma of it, the legal expenses, the distraction, having an arrest record or whatever? And I think the effect is to try to scare people into silence by going after people like Yves Engler, who in Canada, by the way, I mean, he's a great activist and writer and advocate. He's written for the Electronic Intifada many times. But one thing he's done, and this is, again, pure speculation on my part. I'm just guessing here, but he has often disrupted Canadian genocidal politicians at public events, going up on stage, confronting them with their crimes. And so I think... And
just filming them, Ali, like on the street, asking them questions. Why are you supporting a genocide?
Yeah. So this is revenge. It's revenge. Yeah. It's revenge. Yeah. Because, you know, no CBC journalist will ever dare do that.
Correct.
So that's what this is. It's thuggery.
Yeah, I mean, I've had my own experiences with that, and I think that you're right. I want to segue soon into what's happening in Gaza with the captive and prisoner exchanges, but one more question. You know, I think this is an outcome. This is all related to the fallout of the last 15, 16 months of war after October 7th. People can debate who won what tactically on the battlefield, or long-term who gained politically. But it's very clear to me that Israel has lost the information war. They've lost the battle for public opinion. And in Western putative liberal democracies, when the population starts to shift away from Israel, it begins to shift away from Western imperialism as well, and it threatens their ability to maintain the consent of the public and threatens the entire propaganda model. And the only thing left is force and repression. Alex Karp, who is one of the founders of Palantir, and is now the CEO of Palantir, spelled this out really clearly last year at a conference of spooks in Washington when he said, the war on the campuses is the war. And if we lose that war and we lose the war of ideas, then we won't be able to send armies to fight on battlefields anywhere in the West ever again. He's a Zionist fanatic who depends heavily on Israel for AI contracts. And he's right. So I think that's what this is ultimately about. They're trying to raise the cost on Palestine solidarity activism and intimidate journalists who step out of line and create kind of a firewall. It's harder for them to get away with it in the US, but I do expect attempts at terrorism designations for students for justice in Palestine and other groups, investigations of NGOs by the House GOP. Heritage Foundation's Project Esther has spelled this out as a key goal. So in Germany, 60 Minutes, which is basically the part of the mighty Wurlitzer of the US national security state, did a great segment on Germany's repression of people for posting online, showing early morning raids at dozens of people's homes. None of them, I don't know if they were Palestine solidarity activists. Most of them are conspiracy theorists or whatever they're accused of. But Germany sort of, the gloves are off there. The gloves are coming off in the US, but we still have a constitution. So my question, I guess, before segueing, if you have time to stay with us into Gaza and the region, is, do you agree with me? My question is just why? Why is this happening?
Yeah, 100%. It's that they want to control the information environment completely, and they've been incredibly successful. And if you're old enough like me to remember, even 20, 30 years ago, during the run-up to the Iraq War, yes, I don't want to idealize the media. It wasn't great. But even what we call now the legacy media, the mainstream media, was more independent. You would get actual reporting, you would get scrutiny of government policy to some extent. Not the New York Times, they were behind the whole weapons of mass destruction hoax, but even the BBC was better. And it has now just been completely transformed into foreign office propaganda, especially on Russia and Ukraine, but also on Israel and Palestine. And it's just incredible how uniform the message is from the so-called free media, whether it's state-sponsored media like the BBC or the CBC and NPR, or whether it's supposedly independent private media. And we have this ecosystem where the Electronic Intifada, the Grayzone, other channels that many of us watch are breaking through this and having this disproportionate impact on people's thinking. And people don't listen. People don't go to CNN or MSNBC to get analysis and thought about what's happening. And they need to shut this down. And we know that, the work Aaron did on Syria and then on Russiagate really annoys them. And the work that the Grayzone has done really annoys them. The work that the Electronic Intifada has done on debunking October 7th lies and the mass rapes hoax and the burn babies hoax and so on, that has put us in the crosshairs. I don't think it's a coincidence that they went after my colleague Asa Winstanley and then they went after me. And we don't know what will be next. We're trying to be ready for it. And I'll just say this, if I can just let people know that I am taking legal action in Switzerland. And the reason why I'm doing this is because Switzerland is a signatory to the European Convention on Human Rights. And so these rights violations have, these cases will have a Europe-wide impact. I'm fighting them in Switzerland to protect free speech for all of us. We have to fight back. And so I do actually have a legal fund. It's not on GoFundMe. It's on gogetfunding.com, gogetfunding.com, which is a different site, less hostile to Palestinians than GoFundMe. So gogetfunding.com. And it's also linked inside the text of Asa Winstanley's article about my case on the electronic Intifada. I'll just tell you, we've already filed the first appeal against my unlawful detention. More appeals are going in next week. We're finalizing them. I've got a great team of lawyers in Switzerland. Top human rights lawyers have come onto this case, and we will be taking other aggressive legal action, which my lawyers tell me don't go into too much detail. We don't want to necessarily tip people off, but we are fighting this. We're taking a stand, because I think if we don't hold these, I want to know who is responsible for this. Was this an abuse of power by a pro-Israel official? The only way we can find out is by holding them accountable in court. And I still have enough faith in the Swiss legal system that I think this is worth doing. And it's a grassroots effort. So if people are able to chip in, it's very much appreciated.
Well, I dropped the link in the live chat, and I'll be promoting it as well on my own Twitter account and elsewhere. Hey, maybe I'll donate to it. I mean, we need to raise the cost. If they want to raise the cost on us for speaking and doing journalism, we should raise the cost on them for their repression. And this is one way of doing it, through legal channels. And, before we segue, I think that there is a campaign, it may have already succeeded in Europe, to ban the term Intifada, to basically classify it as a form of terrorism. And that's another reason why I think you're being targeted, because you've positively branded Intifada as not just, terrorism and suicide bombing, but journalism, activism, scholarship. And that can't be allowed. Aaron, play us out, in the words of Bill O'Reilly, as we do it live. Help us segue into the next section about what's actually happening on the ground.
Well, there's so much to respond to. I'm wondering your guys' thoughts on this, big, a lot of attention being paid to Hamas turning over the remains of the Bibas family, 9-month-old Kafir Bibas and his 4-year-old brother Ariel. So Hamas returns their remains. It's been a huge controversy tried to be made out of this. Hamas said back in November 2023 that they were killed in an Israeli airstrike. But somehow there's this effort now to paint this as like some new thing that Hamas killed these people. And that, of course, this is leading calls for revenge, which means continuing the genocide. The House Foreign Affairs Committee, controlled by Republicans, put out a statement saying that Hamas executed these children in cold blood, even though, again, there's no evidence for that. And what we do have is Hamas claiming that and they said this back then, in November 2023, that an Israeli strike killed them, which we know has happened many times, because Israel was carrying out indiscriminate bombing of Gaza, and also on October 7th employed the Hannibal directive. And we know that has killed Israelis on October 7th and ever since. But now the Israeli government claims that they've done their own forensic examination of the remains of these two children. And this is what the IDF said. According to the assessment of professional officials, based on the intelligence available to us and forensic findings from the identification process, Ariel and Kafir Bibas were brutally murdered by terrorists in captivity in November 2023.
Well, that's true if you accurately describe the IDF as terrorists, because the IDF is who almost certainly killed them. And there was never any reason for Hamas or whoever who was holding them. I think they actually weren't taken to Gaza by Hamas, but by another group, and held by another group. There's some confusion about not everyone was taken to Gaza as part of a plan. There was some chaos on October 7th because the Israeli defenses collapsed so quickly. But what we do know is that Hamas offered to return all the civilians the next day. And that's something that has even come out in the Israeli press. The families of many of the Israelis have said that we learned that Hamas told the Israeli government, we'll return everyone the next day. And the Israeli government turned that down because they wanted a war. And the bombing, you know, all the captors who've come out have said, or most of them that I've seen accounts have said, the thing that terrified us the most was the Israeli bombing. That was the thing that was going to kill them. And it did kill, by estimates I've read in the Israeli media, about 29 at least of the captives. Hamas has given a higher number at times, but they gave that number in the midst of the bombing when they couldn't necessarily verify things and communicate and move around Gaza easily to find out what was going on. And so there is this cynical attempt to use these children. And when children are in a situation like this, it's never good. It's always tragic. It's always horrible. These are kids. No child ever asked to be put in whatever situation they're in. Children, you know, they're innocent. Children are always innocent. And but what's so cynical is that, you know, Netanyahu is still, he did this in the White House when he was with Trump the other day, going around saying that on October 7th, Hamas burned babies. And we remember Joe Biden saying how he saw the photos of beheaded babies. And the fact is that according to the Israeli official records, mercifully, only one Israeli baby was killed on October 7th, and that was Mila Cohen. And she was hit by a stray bullet that went through a door. So she wasn't even targeted. She was hit by a stray bullet, a horrible tragedy to happen to any child. But it's this absence of babies who could be conscripted and weaponized as part of this genocidal propaganda war that Israel is waging that has driven them to distort this already horrific tragedy into this story where Hamas brutally murdered these babies, when there is, as you said, Max, literally no evidence of that whatsoever. Meanwhile, you know, and Nikki Haley put out a tweet. Nikki Haley put out a tweet also decrying this and saying how brutal this is. This is the same Nikki Haley who went to Israel signing shells and bombs, finish them. She wrote on the shells and bombs that the American shells and bombs that were used to murder more than 20,000 Palestinian children in Gaza, she wrote, finish them. And this psycho, this monster wants to convince us that she cares about the lives of children. It's just utterly grotesque.
And that speaks to the imbalance here. The whole premise is racist. That we've just spent 5 minutes talking about these two Israeli children who were tragically killed. But if we did that about Palestinian children, we'd have to do, you know, months and months and months of segments to talk about them. It's normalized that Israel gets to kill thousands of Palestinian children, but when Israeli
we would be told with a straight face that you know what, the Palestinians are using their children as human shields, or they're deliberately getting them killed just to make Israel look bad. And of course, if we said, and I would never say, you know, we don't use the same logic. Why are Israeli families raising babies within spitting distance of the fence of a concentration camp? It's a historical fact that the so-called Gaza envelope settlements were established as human shields for the territory that Israel had expelled Palestinians from in 1948. These settlements, like Nahal Oz, near the Gaza boundary, were so-called military civilian settlements.
They called them a human wall. A human wall,
human shields. And nobody says that. Nobody says, why are Israelis using their children and their civilians as human shields around a concentration camp, where that's actually what's happening. Not to say I'm okay with any children suffering in such circumstances. I'm not. It's horrific. Any child is, to me, the same. But just the disgusting racist double standards is just hard to wrap one's head around.
Yeah, this is such an important case here, the case of the Bibas family. You can learn so much about the Israeli government cynicism from it, because there was a deal in December 2023 to actually have them out, but it was going to require extending the brief ceasefire, humanitarian pause in that month. And Yarden Bibas, the father, was begging to be able to take his family back to Israel so he could bury them. And he declared explicitly in a video, which I guess I'm not going to play, will somehow be demonetized for it. He was in captivity, so there's a certain level of coercion there, but he declared explicitly that Israel killed them. I mean, and I published the video here. It's out there. I've been calling this out for months and months and months because I knew how this was all going to play out, because 2 children, small children, were killed in a horrible fashion. And no one is allowed to talk about this video. No one is allowed to discuss it. The Western media doesn't mention it. And Yarden Bibas has been released in recent deals. Hamas released him before releasing his family, because he should be asked about this and he would tell the truth now that he is not being coerced, now that he's no longer in captivity. He's the one who could say, oh, actually, Hamas killed my family in cold blood. But he hasn't said it, as far as I know. And Israel is now lying, claiming professional officials, the same ones that probably confirmed the mass rape by Hamas on October 7th, have confirmed that these babies were killed in cold blood. And I mean, this spells it out very well by Prop versus Truth on January 19th. Zionist propaganda parrots are intentionally ignoring this fact that the Bibas family was killed through the Hannibal directive so they can act super outraged when their bodies are swapped. Hamas offered to give their bodies in December 2023 during the temporary truce. So now the Israeli public, the Western public, they've been kept in the dark about this, and now they're being told through Zionist propagandists, whether it's Meghan McCain or Nikki Haley or Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli army, that they were brutally killed by Hamas, just taken and killed, as if they wouldn't want collateral in order to get the many hundreds of Palestinian children who are in Israeli prisons under administrative detention without charges out. Why would they do it? It makes no sense. And then you have just the pattern, the extensive pattern of Israel killing captives in Gaza, Israel killing Jewish captives in Gaza. As many as 40 of them have been killed. This is Noah Don, who is one of the leading voices of the kind of hostage yellow ribbon families in Israel, declaring on Israel's Channel 11, her uncle, Ofer Calderon, was in Gaza. We are being killed by the Hannibal procedure. Those are her words. My cabinet, my prime minister, my defense minister are carrying out operations on my family, on men and women who are kidnapped from their homes. The Hannibal procedure. We understand that we are killing our people. I mean, there have been many high-profile incidents of Israel indisputably killing Israeli captives. Remember when 3 captives broke out waving a Hebrew banner to Israeli troops, and the Israeli troops shot them and even pursued them and killed them execution style because they thought they were Palestinian. This is a Reuters headline. Israeli troops killed hostages, mistaking their cries for help as ambush. Military. An Israeli investigation confirmed that they killed 3 others through airstrikes, just as they killed the Bibas family.
And
Israel says high probability its own airstrike killed 3 hostages in Gaza last November. And Hirsch Goldberg Polin, who's one of the few hostages killed by Hamas or the Al-Qassam brigades because Israeli troops were advancing and attempting to break him out by force, had actually warned in his own video from captivity that the airstrikes had nearly killed him many times. Noah Argamani, another hostage, former captive, said the same thing, that 2 of her Israelis who were being held with her were killed by Israeli airstrikes. So, I mean, the evidence is pretty clear. Israel chose bloodlust over getting the captives out.
Yeah, and Max, even if we disregard the video from Kfir Bibas and disregard, anything else, it's certain that Israel could have gotten all these people out if they had agreed to extend the truce. Remember that 9-10-day truce at the end of November 2023, when 100 Israelis were sent home from Gaza. And they had the option to extend it. Hamas wanted to extend it and get all these people out because protecting them was an enormous burden. It was extremely difficult to protect them. They wanted to keep the military POWs, but they didn't want to keep women and children and babies and so on. And they could have gotten them out but Israel was determined to go back to genocide. They thought at that point that their genocide would succeed, and that was their priority, not getting these people out. I don't know if we have time to show this very brief video. It's like 30 plus seconds. Maybe you already showed it on a previous show of Yoav Gallant, who is the Israeli defense minister, on October 7th, and for the first year or so of the genocide, admitting the use of the Hannibal directive on national Israeli television just a week or 2 ago.
Yeah, I got it right here. Well, I'll show like a even shorter version of it just to illustrate your point. The order given to use Hannibal directive, I think tactically in some places it was, in other places it wasn't, and that was a problem. Well,
yeah, so is the problem there that it wasn't used everywhere? I think that's what that's what I interpret what he's saying. Yeah. But the important thing here is he's not the first one to say this. We have so many confirmations of the use of the Hannibal directive. There have been these sort of post-mortems done by the Israeli army where it's come out in the Israeli media that the Hannibal order was given, specifically using that word. But I think Yoav Gallant is the highest ranking official to confirm that the Hannibal directive was used. So from October 7th, they were trying to kill their own captives, and they continued trying to kill them throughout the genocide, either deliberately or I think just because they didn't care. It's like in some of the cases, and this could have been the case with the Bibas family, that they were just killed unintentionally because the bombing was so indiscriminate. But the point is they were willing to let them be killed. They didn't care enough, and they were willing to they had all these schemes to flood the tunnels and gas the tunnels and all this stuff that never really worked. But with the idea, you had families, all this was being discussed in the Israeli media, that, we're going to flood the tunnels and gas the tunnels. And the families of the Israeli captives were saying, wait a minute, what if our loved ones are in those tunnels? And basically it was like, well, we don't care.
Well, and several Israeli soldiers, including Ron Sherman, who were held captive in Gaza, were gassed to death when they attempted to fill the tunnels with diesel gas. So Israel was gassing Jews to death in Gaza.
And his mom confirmed that.
His mother confirmed it, and an Israeli publication, 972 Mag, has a long piece about it. But this was confirmed long ago. Look up Ron Sherman. Aaron,
before we go, should we comment on the other major developments that are happening? So, I'm curious both your thoughts on these. So Netanyahu is reportedly making new demands, as he always does, to Hamas on phase 2 of the Gaza ceasefire. And this is a classic Netanyahu ploy, just constantly insisting on new conditions that he knows Hamas can't accept. And then you have also Netanyahu ordering an intensified assault on the West Bank in response to the strange development of a bunch of empty or 3 parked empty buses in Israel being blown up. And in response to that, Netanyahu is now ordering more attacks on the West Bank.
Yeah, like worst bus attack ever from the point of view of someone who wants to damage Israel, but best pretext, immediate pretext to intensify operations in the West Bank. And it wouldn't be the first time Israel has done something like this. It really raises questions in my mind about an attack we questioned, which led to our total demonetization. I wasn't even allowed to post the segment when I tried to clip it out on a certain town in the occupied Syrian Golan Heights, where there was an attack, which gave Israel the justification to open up all-out assault all across Lebanon and assassinate the leadership of Hezbollah. So it really raises questions about a lot of things that have occurred in the past 15 or 16 months.
Yeah, I remember in the 90s and early 2000s when there was a spate of, there were these sort of mysterious bombings that never really injured anyone, but were just perfectly timed to provide Israel with a pretext for whatever it wanted to do. And I always suspected that those were not what Israel said they were. And I don't know what this was. Maybe this is some type of false flag. Maybe it is a warning shot by resistance groups to say we could look how we can I'm speculating. I don't know. But I think if it is what Israel says it is, let's suppose that this is done by Palestinians from the West Bank. What does it tell you? It tells you that there is no level of genocide and murder and repression that Israel can do to Palestinians that can make Israelis secure. That's the message here. I mean, if we take them at their word. And what kind of a future is there for Israel or for Israelis? I think a lot of Israelis are going to be saying, well, nothing. The only thing they're promising us is more of this. And also the economy is destroyed. Inward investment is collapsing. Tourism is collapsed. So I don't think the ceasefire or the end of this war, if that's what this is now, means the end of Israel's troubles. I think that a lot of people are going to be saying, how can I get out of here? How can I get to Canada, to the US, to Germany, which has which is a very welcoming place for Israelis, not for Jews. A lot of the people being repressed for their Palestine activism in Germany are Jews, but Israelis are certainly welcome. There was the other part of your question, Max or Aaron.
Netanyahu making new demands.
Yeah. Phase 2 of the deal. Yeah, I mean, it's clear that Netanyahu doesn't want this deal, but I don't know if he's going to be able to wriggle out of it, because it's clear that the Israeli public wants it. The polls show that people don't want to go back to the war, not out of any love for the Palestinians, but they are exhausted. The Israeli army was broken, it was shattered, and they want to see people come back. And now they are seeing people coming back, whereas 16 months of genocide, nobody came back, or very few people came back, and people, their captors were being killed. Steve Witkoff, the Trump envoy who initially imposed the deal on Netanyahu, something the Biden administration would never have done, said, I think today or yesterday, that they are still very committed to phase 2 and they're going to make it happen. And he also has been walking back Trump's comments, Riviera comments about Gaza, and saying, oh, the president is just putting out like this vision. It's like nothing concrete. So it seems that they have, their intent or their desire to ethnically cleanse Palestinians may still be there, but it seems like they are recognizing that this is not something that they're capable of doing. If Israel couldn't do it in 16 months of throwing everything they have at Palestinians in Gaza, how is Donald Trump going to do it? That's to say, I'm still fairly optimistic that phase 2 will happen. I think Netanyahu is going to try to put as many obstacles as possible, but as long as the Trump administration is committed to it, and so far they seem to be, despite Trump's, off the wall comments, I think I would say it's still more likely than not to happen. But the question is, what's the long term? Because I think the biggest danger for Palestinians in Gaza is the continuation of genocide by siege and starvation, and putting so many conditions on reconstruction that people are kept in this situation of utter destruction and desperation. And Israel is definitely trying to do that by all its violations of the humanitarian protocols of these accords and of this ceasefire deal. And one thing we have to remember about how depraved this world has become is that in the laws of war, humanitarian aid, water, food, medicine, is never supposed to be a topic of negotiation. It's not a bargaining chip. These things are supposed to reach civilian populations in times of war without condition. But now, food for babies, medicine for babies, is one of Israel's weapons of war where you have to negotiate for it. So why do Palestinians even have to hold on to captives in Gaza? I mean, I'm not justifying it. I'm just saying from their perspective, if Israel had for the last 2 decades actually allowed people in Gaza to exercise their basic humanitarian rights. I'm not talking about anything other than the basic humanitarian rights of being able to get their basic needs met. This would not have happened. And now they're being told, we're not going to let you get anything into Gaza without you paying a price. And so that only incentivizes Palestinians to look for whatever way they can to hold some card over Israel. And that's what the captives are. None of this would be necessary if Israel, the United States, and Israel's other sponsors, particularly its European sponsors, would make it just abide by international humanitarian law, which is that food and medicine are not weapons.
Absolutely. Couldn't have said it better. I wanted to cover the Florida incident, but I don't know if we have time to do that. Do we have 2 minutes for this? Mordecai Brofman.
I'm going to leave you guys to it to do that story. I'll say goodnight. Ali, great to see you.
Good to see you, Aaron.
See you guys.
I'll let Max do it, and I'll just listen because
all right. We'll sign off. I'll just read it really quickly. A Zionist fanatic in Florida, where all the crazy stuff happens, disproportionate amounts of bizarre incidents involving guns happen in the U.S. Shot 2 men he thought were Palestinian. They turned out to be Israeli tourists in Miami. And those Israelis claimed that they were, instead of being shot by a Jewish Zionist fanatic, were shot by a anti-Semite, and posted "Death to the Arabs" on Facebook, even though they were shot by a fellow Zionist fanatic. So I don't know what to say about this. 2 false flags.
Well, here's another one, Max, for you that just came up today. Put this one up if you can, and I'll read the headline. This is from Middle East Eye, but it's being reported elsewhere too. Israeli man attacks Jewish woman, mistaking her for a Christian. A woman in occupied East Jerusalem was seriously wounded on Wednesday after an assailant allegedly attacked her with an axe inside her home. Israeli journalist Yossi Eli reported on Thursday that police suspect the attack was motivated by anti-Christian hatred. The victim, a Jewish Israeli woman, was taken to hospital for treatment, while the suspect, also Jewish Israeli, allegedly mistook her for a Christian. So I don't know if this is like an epidemic of Israeli on Israeli violence, where they think that in the Florida case, he thought the two Israelis he shot were Palestinians, and here it's this Israeli guy thought that the person he was attacking was a Christian. So is it Israeli society eating itself? I don't know.
Yeah, I was going to say 2 false flags don't make a right. I don't know what to say. The guy is claiming a mental health crisis for shooting Israeli tourists. I think the mental health crisis is Zionism. And the Israeli, I mean, what this is like an old Borscht Belt joke. Like 2 groups of Zionist fanatics mistake each other for Palestinians, and you won't believe what happened next. It's like a very dark episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm. But it's also a metaphor for Israeli society eating itself alive.
Yeah. And the 2 shooting victims in Florida.
Hannibal, someone said. That's good.
Oh, that's a great one. But apparently one of those posted and then took it down like, death to Arab. They called it an anti-Semitic attack, the shooting victims in Florida.
Yeah.
And said death to Arabs. So it's like the shooter thought his victims were Palestinians, and the victims thought their shooter was Arab or Palestinian, and in fact they were all Israeli Jews. So,
well, it's kind of like if you remove all the Palestinians, like the Kahana plan finally succeeds, what happens to Jewish Israeli society? Like, what will they do to each other? How will they live without an enemy? They'll just kind of have to find one among themselves.
And that's already happening for sure.
This is your brain on Zionism. Kids, don't take Zionism. It's a very dangerous drug. Ziocaine, don't do it. Ali, any closing words? We'll promote your case, your heroic case against the Swiss government one more time for its repression of your speech and journalism and jailing you and abusing you for simply seeking to speak about Palestine. The link is at Go Get Funding, not GoFundMe. Go Get Funding. Just look it up and look up Ali's name, Ali Abunimah.
And check out the story by my colleague Asa, also a victim of this repression, that's at the Electronic Intifada, because it's actually linked on the Go Get Funding page, so you can find all the information there. But just some of the bizarre stuff that is coming soon to a so-called democracy near you to shut us all down. And so I just believe we have to take a stand and fight back. And I'm gonna do it, take it as far as I can. It could go all the way to the European Court of Human Rights. I hope we don't need to go that far, because I hope that the courts will see sense, but we'll see.
Well, we'll keep talking about that here. We'll keep talking about Richard Medhurst as well. It's a really obscene case.
And we need to follow up on Yves Engler too, and send him all our love and solidarity. Yves is doing great work, and I believe that's why they're targeting him. There's no question in my mind.
No doubt about it. Well, Ali, thanks so much for joining us and volunteering your valuable time. Everyone follow the Electronic Intifada. Subscribe to the Grayzone on YouTube, on Rumble. Hit the like button, because we are algorithmically suppressed and demonetized on YouTube. And thanks for being here and for supporting us any way you can. You can Subscribe to our Substack for free. We're putting up lots of content there. And we will see you next week. So with another great guest, hopefully. I really want to discuss, by the way, Javier Milei and his responsibility for one of the worst scams in human history through his Libra meme coin. We have a great report by Wyatt Reed on our site. So we're going to try and get Wyatt and his co-author, Oscar Leon, on. And we are also working on a full-length or a documentary series on Javier Milei. So look for that. But yeah, we'll be back next week. Thanks again. Peace.